The failures of Silicon Valley Bank and several others have certainly shocked investors, but it's got me wondering, guys, are there some takeaways from this banking crisis that people can apply to retirement planning?
Well, Chaz, this one actually has been a very interesting case. I've heard you explain the situation countless times about this and go over the last couple of weeks and go over some different things. What do you tell the listeners today, and what should they know about SVB? And I did hear on the news that there's a bank out of Raleigh that is actually purchasing the assets and the debt. But what do you tell people?
Yeah. So to be clear, SVB wasn't diversified. It was kind of concentrated in the Silicon Valley, specialized in startups, real aggressive tech companies generally. So by nature, they were more aggressive. They also didn't have a great emergency fund. So, not having the appropriate savings in place and emergency liquidity, like we talked about, Jerome Powell said, yeah, it's kind of your fault. I get that we did some interest rate increases, but you got to have the liquidity to weather the storm. And risk just wasn't well managed. And I think this is a concern, or kind of a little known nuance of the banking sector. I think people in general think that banks are very conservative, just in nature. But what people don't know is that because they're stock held, in many cases controlled by their shares of stock that you can own, the investors really want the banks to take more risk because they're protected through FDIC insurance. And so this is what happens when they take that, that stockholder sort of philosophy and mentality to heart and do everything they can to prop up, the stock price versus actually taking a look at the community and what it does to a bank failure into the system. So, but I digress. But there are some takeaways I think we could all learn from a situation like SVB. And the first is, again, risk management. And a lot of banks do have very robust risk management practices, but you can see when things aren't followed or when they miss some things. And so I think it's important that if you're listening and you're not sure what your risk tolerance is, if you've never had a risk assessment done by your advisor, give us a call here at America's Retirement Headquarters, and we'll let you know very simply what your speed limit is. You've heard Nolan and I talk about your risk number. That's exactly what we give our clients, and conceptually it makes a lot of sense in that it's similar to the speed at which you're driving a car you feel comfortable with, maybe. Might have some correlations with that. The other thing is being diversified. Again, not having all of your eggs in one basket. SVB Bank was a great example of, basically, working only with one particular client. The Silicon Valley tech startups, you want to be diversified in your investment approach as well. And I think having some insurance in place, we're, as investors, we don't have the FDIC insurance necessarily backing us. We certainly do have banks, and we have bank accounts that are protected through FDIC. You have Securities Investor Protection Corporation, but I don't know if I feel comfortable with that. I don't want to rely on a government agency to bail us out all the time.
Yeah, because we don't have that. We as investors in bank, we're not the investors, but the depositors in the bank, we're only insured to a certain amount. We don't have. The banks are covered,
right?
But we don't have, the FDIC in our back pocket.
Exactly. And that doesn't protect you in the stock price dropping. So if you own a bunch of stock, and your bank deposits are protected, but what about your stock? So I think having your own insurance plan, not necessarily insurance is what you might think about it, but having some emergency cash set aside and investing in investments that aren't tied to the stock market, that have a principal guarantee that worst case scenario, the money's going to be there regardless of who's in office or what bank failed or whatnot. And then the other point that I think we could all take away, which I really liked from the Fed, was that they made a very decisive, very direct decision. There was no parlance about, well, we kind of got to see who wants to buy who. No, the president came out the next day and said, hey, we're gonna back depositors. You're gonna be fine. Right. So I think if you can take anything away from this calamity as an investor, it's know your risk, be diversified, have your own insurance or your rainy day fund or your worst case scenario and plan, and either be willing to take decisive action yourself or have an advisor, an advisory team that's willing to do it on your behalf. And we have the tools and the technology and honestly the talent to kind of be that person for you, whether it be our circuit breaker technology or the independent income system that
Right.
is a proprietary method that we use to determine how much you need in each one of those buckets. I think if you can take anything away from it, it's those four things, and that's what we provide here.
Yeah, I was in banking for 15 years prior to coming into insurance, and I remember they had so many committee meetings, and they have all of these regulations that they had to follow, and is this is an isolated? No, it's not isolated because it'll happen again.
Yeah.
I mean, once they put all these regulations in place and they go through and who knows, sometime down the road it's going to happen. I mean, look at history, like Nolan says, history repeats itself, right?
Or it rhymes at least.
It rhymes, yes. I remember sitting in a lot of meetings with some of these bank officials and hearing and seeing some of the things that all of the regulations that they had to follow. And as years go by, they start to push the envelope, so to speak. So, like Chaz says, there's a lot of, he give you a lot of good advice on how to make sure that you can at least protect yourself in the event that something like this happens in the future, and, reach out to us.
It's not just learning from your own mistakes, but learning from the mistakes of others. And so some questions you should ask yourself, certainly, are you diversified? Do you have an emergency fund? And how are you as far as risk management goes? If you don't know the answers to these, you're not sure, or you just want a second set of eyes on them, I think it could do a lot of wonders to have a conversation with the team at America's Retirement Headquarters. Here's how you do so: 419-794-3030. Let them show you before it becomes a much bigger issue down the line. 419-794-3030. Or go to the website arhq.com.